Yesterday, when we left Odysseus and his men, they were approaching Scylla's cave. They've made it kind of past Charybdis, the whirlpool monster, but now he knows they have Scylla to fight. And if you look at the front cover of our book, I believe what we have here is Odysseus with his two spears and Scylla, the six-headed monster. We finally made it there. Here we go. As the Greeks drew closer and closer to Scylla's lair, Odysseus glared fiercely at her mist-shrouded cave. But suddenly, Odysseus forgot all about Scylla, for his attention was seized by the roaring sea. Just off the bow of the ship, the whirlpool monster Charybdis was sucking up tons of black water and vomiting it out. Spray from the monster's mouth rained down on the deck. The sea around the ship bubbled and churned like water roiling in a giant cauldron. Odysseus could see into the center of the whirlpool, a deep cavity filled with black ooze and mud. If his ship veered even slightly toward the swirling water, it would surely be sucked down into the darkness. Odysseus dropped his spears. "Hold our course!" he shouted to his men. "Row with all your might toward the towering cliff!" Odysseus's men cried out in fear. At that moment, Scylla stuck her hideous heads out of her cave. In an instant, the monster's six long neck swooped down toward the sea. She grabbed Odysseus's best warriors in her six mouths. As she lifted the helpless Greeks high into the air, the men writhed like fish caught by a giant fisherman. Odysseus saw bloody hands and feet dangling from Scylla's mouths. He heard the men scream his name, begging for help. The hideous monster devoured her victims before Odysseus's eyes. It was the most terrible sight of his life. Odysseus knew now that Circe had been right. He had been foolish to think he could slay the monster. The only way to save the rest of his men was to speed away from her as swiftly as possible. "Row, row," he shouted. "If you value your lives, row with all your strength." The men rowed frantically past the tall cliff. With Odysseus urging them on, they sped through the channel until they were finally safe from both sea monsters, Scylla and Charybdis. But we have one more test, don't we? We have the island of the sun god. And remember, they said you cannot lay a hand on any of the cattle. Odysseus stood at the helm of his ship. He stared into the churning sea behind him, horrified by the cruel slaughter of his men. Their screams still rang in his ears. The sight of their bloody, struggling limbs was imprinted on his memory forever. But Odysseus knew that the rest of his men needed him now. Their fear and trembling forced him to rally himself and take command. "Row on," he said, lifting his head in the wind. "Do not look back. Do not think about what you've seen, or we will never find our way home." Too stunned to even speak, the Greeks picked up their oars. Like obedient children, they rowed on. The black ship sped across the wine-dark sea. Soon the Greeks saw a sun-drenched island in the distance. They heard the lowing of cattle and bleating of sheep. Odysseus's men rejoiced at the sounds. After their terrible ordeal, they yearned for rest and shelter and food. "Soon we will feast on beef and mutton," they exclaimed. Odysseus did not rejoice. He knew that he and his men were approaching the island of the sun god. He remembered the stern warnings of the prophet Tiresias and the counsel of Circe. "Heed what I tell you," he said to his crew. "I know you crave food and rest, but the island ahead belongs to Helios, the sun god. We cannot seek provisions there. I have been warned by the prophet Tiresias and by Circe. They told me that the sun god adores his cattle and sheep, and that if one of you even dares touch them, you will all die." Upon hearing these words, the men nearly collapsed with weariness and anguish. "Then let us die here," said one, "for we will surely die at sea if we do not eat and rest soon." "Listen to me," Odysseus said. "If we stop now, all of our trials, All our triumphs and all our losses will have been for naught. We must move past this island. We must keep rowing. The men protested again. When Odysseus would not hear their pleas, Eurylochus, the second in command on the ship, shouted at him in anger. Odysseus, you are too strong, he said. You are made of iron. The rest of us are not. We are only human. These men need rest from their labor and time to mourn their losses. They cannot row through the night. Let us heed the darkness. Let us stop on the island to rest. We will cook our own food and sleep on the sand. We will set sail again at dawn without even laying eyes upon the precious cattle and sheep of the sun god. The men cheered the plan put forth by Eurylochus, but Odysseus's heart was filled with dread. Even though the plan seemed sound, Odysseus felt as if some angry god were plotting against him. Still, he knew there was no way now he could convince his men to row on. You force me to surrender to your will, he said. I cannot fight you all. But if we do as Eurylochus asks, you must swear an oath. You must promise not to touch a single head of the sun god's cattle or sheep. You must be satisfied only with the food that Circe has given us. The men swore to do as Odysseus commanded. Soon they dropped anchor in a sheltered bay of Helios' island. Near the shore, the Greeks found a spring of fresh water. They set up camp and made a meal from Circe's gifts of meat and bread and wine. Once the men had satisfied their hunger and thirst, painful memories swept over them. They wept for their 6 comrades eaten alive by the monster Scylla. Her victims had been the strongest and best of Odysseus's warriors. The Greeks wept also for the others on their voyage who had been slain by monsters and giants. They mourned their losses deep into the night until sleep mercifully overcame them. It's been a while since we checked in on what your thoughts are on Odysseus. So on the next slide, I want you to tell me, what character trait do you think describes Odysseus now? Maybe it's the same that you thought of in the beginning of the book, but maybe you think he's changed a little bit. Maybe you found out some new things about him. I, for one, think he's actually very courageous. Maybe arrogant, but courageous nonetheless. Then you're going to tell me a piece of evidence from the book. So, why do you think that? What happened in the book that made you know that he had that character trait? And then I'll see you back here tomorrow. We only have 2 days of the Odyssey left. Can't wait to find out if he makes it back home to Ithaca. It's not looking so good. See you guys back here tomorrow.